part 2. I said a bit lost in this one. I don't know how many parts it's going to be broken into. Maybe it looks about 4 or 5 parts. But let's crack on, see where we get to. Know what you don't know and trust in what you do know. The first rule is not to fake anything. Yeah. It's just so embedded, isn't it, Fight Club? You have to be humble, and you can't pretend to be someone you're not or to know something you do not. There is a word for that. Faith. Hope is another. Neither a plan for success. Iger notes, in a position of leadership, you can't let humility prevent you from leading. It's a fine line. Leadership is all well and good, and showing people that it's okay to not know something is the first step, and then not punishing ignorance is the next step, and making space and allowance for acquisition and integration and application of that knowledge or know-how, technique, assets is the next. That's fine, that's good. Yet using faith or hope, the force, if you will, whatever, is like spinning the roulette wheel. The odds are stacked against it. Iger continues, you have to ask the questions you need to ask, admit without apology what you do not understand, and do the work to learn what you need to learn as quickly as you can. Exactly. First thing to learn then, which questions to ask, and how to ask them. Iger summarises, there's nothing less confidence-inspiring than a person faking a knowledge they do not possess. True authority and true leadership come from knowing who you are and not pretending to be anything else. Interesting that Iger makes mention of knowing who you are. Who are you? I mean, I'm really asking. Who are you? Yeah, I know you're that, but you're that plus a whole lot of other things as well. And you're a lot more than all those things too. And whatever that is, you're more than that. Who are you again? Iger reiterates to keep that ego in check. Muji talks about the ego a lot and the trap that it keeps setting for us. Persig, Alan Watts, the same. It's all good stuff. I think we covered this as well in D.A.R.P.A and Weight Skin and the Art of Learning. And I haven't got to Ryan Holiday's book either, but I'm told that's a good read. So quickly, Iger transitions from sports to primetime TV. Iger notes a difference in the two, but underlines a similarity that both require structure, pacing, and clarity. The Last Jedi. What comes through, having also read Disney's Wars, is that these things have their different recipes and accordingly different structures. TV shows, movies, theme parks, animations, hotels. There is a magic formula or a ratio of things that seem to make these work well. Discovery is part of that. Finding that knowledge quickly and finding the formula. It is business development. Finding the business plan that works. Recognizing the talent, providing the training and development of that talent, and so on, standard operating procedure. Iger makes mention of TV shows like Doogie Howser, Family Matters, America's Funniest Home Videos, which leads into a discussion about David Lynch. Twin Peaks. I never saw it. I was in college at the time, busy discovering other things, and life at that time was strange enough for me. I didn't need added twists. But it seemed popular. The in crowd were talking a lot about it. I do recall that much. And it was a conundrum for Iger. A risk. Something new, different, dark, original, no pre-known formula. Iger says this test was the rune lesson all over again. Innovate or die. And there was a lot of pushback on this. And, as is now obvious, Iger pushed forward and justified the decision by stating it was a risk worth taking. Cool. But the book doesn't explicate the analysis behind that risk. Pity. Anyway, it was a hit until it wasn't. Audience expectations started to influence executive interference. Iger reveals Lynch was brilliant, but not a TV producer. The antagonism with the TV audience was a problem, and reading between the lines, it seems the speed and pace for TV production is very different from film. There's a storytelling discipline too. With a film, you need to get people in for a couple of hours and give them a good experience and hope that they leave the theatre engaged and enthralled. With TV, you have to keep them coming back week after week, season after season. And during a little bit of background reading, I discovered that Lost, the TV series, was greenlit without even a script. And I recall watching season 1 thinking, wow, I wonder where this is going. It turns out at that moment I was aligned with the actual script writers. Who knew? Well, I think we cottoned on soon enough. That one meandered a bit. But it didn't matter. It was compelling all the same. I thought it was great TV, but a lot of people panned it. Yeah. For those keeping track, I think we talked in the previous video about different narrative styles, linear, spiraling, branching. Definitely branching in Lost. Definitely the branching type. Lynch just didn't have sensibilities attuned for television, says Iger. He says, you need to resolve the mystery, or at least give people some hope that it will be resolved. It's beginning to frustrate the audience, including me, Iger said. It says in the book that Lynch felt that the mystery wasn't the most important element of the show. In his ideal version, would never find out who the killer was. However, after that discovery, the storytelling became a mess. There was no engine propelling the story after the mystery was resolved. Iger confesses, in retrospect, Lynch may have been right all along, and that it was Iger's own desire to know who killed Laura Palmer that threw the show into another kind of narrative disarray. The Last Jedi. It's easy to rip on it, isn't it? The passion it takes to create something is powerful, and most creators are understandably sensitive when their vision or execution is questioned. Iger keeps this in mind whenever engaging with someone on the creative side of the business. He advises to be sensitive to artistic efforts. Never start out negatively in criticism, and never start small. Focusing on details at the outset, Iger says, is a way of masking a clear lack of coherent big thoughts. So, big picture, drilled down to small details is the way. Yeah, indeed, the same with recruitment. Ask the big questions first to qualify out quickly, and then use a finer filter as the process goes on. Moneyball, great film, was an excellent example. There's no point in asking the small questions if the big questions are not answered. If the big picture is a mess, the details won't matter. This was tested with Black Panther. And Iger's feedback, he said, you have created a very special film. I have some specific notes, but before I give them to you, I want you to know we have a tremendous faith in you. Fuck me, Bob, I'd be very fucking worried if someone said that to me. Special, that's like that word, interesting. And to have faith in someone is to pretend or to have a capacity to believe something you know isn't true. Even more worrisome. Try again, dude. Your criticism game sucks. The way Iger put it, this is all a way of stating what might seem obvious but is often ignored. A delicate balance is required between management being responsible for the financial performance of any creative work and, in exercising that responsibility, being careful not to encroach on the creative process in harmful and counterproductive ways. Empathy is a prerequisite to the sound management of creativity, and respect is critical. A long story. Is it worth going for a diversion here? Yeah, fuck it, why not? It's not like me to stay on track, is it? So I remember reading in David Sandler's books on sales training about, let's not spoil it, there was a young girl at school, and it was art class, and the assignment was to do a painting or a drawing of a seaside, something like that. So the young girl did a great painting, blue sky, soft lovely clouds, little bit of sea, wake, sand, couple of rocks, that kind of thing. And she thought it was a good painting. And the teacher came along and said, yeah, that's a good painting. It's missing one thing though. And the teacher picked up a brush with a dab of white paint, painted in a little V in the top right corner of a seagull. Well, this upset the child. Oh dear, tantrums. So later that night, kids at home with mum and dad. Her dad comes home from work, sees that his daughter's upset, crying, something about school, something about painting, blah, blah, blah. You know what dads are like. So dad says, well, tell me more. What happened? Oh, daddy, here's my painting. Look at my painting. Dad, gets up the enthusiasm because, that 6-year-olds' paintings are not exactly masterpieces. So he looks at the painting and goes, oh, wow. And I really like the seagull. Oh dear, more tears, more drama. So mum and dad find out what happened, and it all gets out of hand and ends up going to court. The parents sued the school, something about creative differences, or I don't know, theft of art. I don't even know what the case was brought on. It's probably anecdotal. Maybe it happened once upon a time somewhere in a galaxy far, far, far away. I just can't get Star Wars out of my head. Anyway, judge calls up the little girl, says, so what's the crack? What's going on? Why is it such a big deal to be upset by this seagull being painted there? And the little girl says, kind of, well, it's my painting. I just didn't see it there. Case closed. Found in favour of little girl and parents. So I don't know. I mean, you tell me, is Iger's feedback game sucky? I don't know. I think professional artists are a pragmatic lot. The problem seems to come when artists are expected to work for free because, well, it's only art. Anyway, then came Cop Rock, another risk. This one didn't pay off. It was a disaster that came and went fast. You can't win them all. Iger says, we tried something big and it didn't work. I'd much rather take big risks and sometimes fail than not take risks at all. You can't erase your mistakes or pin your bad decisions on someone else. You have to own up to it. You have to own your failures. Yeah, true. We've all got history. We've all made mistakes, and not one of us hasn't done something that wasn't problematic. Demonstrating learning and understanding and change is enough for most people to forgive. Some of us don't. Yes. That's ambiguous. Applies to both cases. I remember what was done. Anyway, it also helps to have deep reserves of capital to learn from those mistakes and not get wiped out. But also, don't go balls deep the first time. This is how problematic happens. Before making $1 million film, make a $200,000 film. And before that, make a $20,000 film. And only before doing that, make one for $1,000. If you lose half your money, it's only $500 and cheap learning. Next time, because of the learning, you might only lose 25% of your money, which on that $20,000 film would be about $5,000. It's a bit more of an expensive education, but from those experiences and learnings, and perhaps on the third go, we might only lose 15% due to new mistakes, which on that $200,000 film would make about $30,000 worth of education. A lot less than if that was the first film that incurred a 50% loss, which would be crippling debts or almost potentially career-ending failure. Then came another risk, NYPD Blue, pushing the limits of what's acceptable on television. Advertisers dropped out, and then the show became very popular, and lasted for 12 years, winning all kinds of awards. Success obsoletes the behaviour that created it. And then the adverts flocked back. So much for risks. Iger makes mention of meetings and how he makes a point to engage everyone present, not just the head honchos. He makes the point to connect with everyone, and I agree. Refreshing to hear this. Lots to be said about office dynamics and communication, de Bono's thinking caps, the order of questions, meta filters and so on, blah, 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 blah. It brings coherence from hearing things first-hand rather than second-hand or filtered through some agent or agency that has ulterior motives. It keeps everyone honest. And it's not just necessarily honest, it keeps people precise, because others were in that room and heard the same thing. And if one person has a distorted or warped view or opinion of what happened, then they know that others that were in the room that say, no, that's not what happened, has more weight than saying, oh, well, my boss didn't say that that's what happened, which carries no weight at all. So less than a year later, circumstances would see Iger promoted again to COO of Capital Cities / ABC. It would seem that this is one of those rare instances where timing, circumstances, luck, and the heavens aligned. As a rule, Iger would not promote someone so rapidly as they promoted him. He repeats, the way they conveyed their faith in him at every step made all the difference in that success. I think he means Dan, he means Dan and Tom Murphy. And this sentiment is repeated by Warren Buffett in books I've read about him. Give people a fine reputation to live up to. I don't think it was even Buffett who came up with that in the first place. Seems like he might have got it from Dan and Tom, and probably they got it from someone else, and I think it's probably summarised in that book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Is that Carnegie? I think it's Carnegie. Yeah, but I'm still struggling to resolve this kind of conflict or paradox or whatever you want to call it. I wish people wouldn't use the word faith. It's so ambiguous. Does it mean that faith to have a confidence in things from grounded in empirical data that strongly predicts the future? Or does it mean hope and prayer type of faith, pretending to know something that can't be known, like knowing that someone will do well? You can only pretend to know that. You can't state it with certainty based on anything, past performance? In a context of future uncertainty and risk-taking? I don't know how you can say it, but this is it. Are we going on false hope and belief? Is the leap of faith? Just doesn't gel with me. I really struggle with it because I have seen people take those leaps of faith and they do really well. But I'm wondering if there isn't some kind of survivor's bias. We only hear from the ones for whom it worked. The others are either in jail, bankrupt and destitute, or worse. Anyway, Disney now enters the frame by acquiring Capital Cities / ABC. In this story in Iger's book, this is where Michael Eisner enters the story. Reading Disney World, which is a story about Eisner's era at Disney, it's the other way around. In that story, this is where Iger enters the picture. So it's quite interesting reading Disney World after Iger's book. Yeah, there's lots of stuff between the lines and kind of what was said in one book and what wasn't said in that book, but it was said in the other book that didn't or failed to mention what, later came to be, obviously. Interesting. Yeah, lots of between the lines stuff. Like how Eisner had run Disney without a number 2 since Frank Wells was killed in the helicopter crash. Lots of machinations going on. There's much more detail in Disney Wars about the financial incentives, the management machinations and board decisions and business strategy and, shareholder influence and people behind the scenes kind of having undue influence. Yeah, we'll get back onto that maybe. So with this acquisition, Disney doubled in size. The proposition was that Iger would stay on post-merger for 5 years, and there were reasons not to do this for Iger, mostly around Iger's wife, whose rising career was geographically bound on the other side of the country. Nevertheless, it's no surprise what happened. It's boring to state it like that. Iger really hams it up in his book, and if I've learned nothing from Bacon, don't bore people, but the book tells it much better, and that's what the book is all about. It's a really good entertaining read. Entertain people first. Yeah, Iger does it well, especially talking about this event, which at the time was one of the biggest media mergers in history. For example, he was at dinner with a Jesuit priest and a Jewish cantor to organise a Jewish Catholic wedding between him and his wife that was being constantly interrupted by phone calls about this merger. Well, he tells the story way better, but, what do you expect? Disney man. And, don't want to take away from the book. It's in the book. It's a good read. But it's not where I'm trying to get to with the business insights or the decision insights or the strategy. Yeah, so defo check out the book. One of the sticking points on the merger was over who Iger was to report to, whether he would be president, COO, or what. Eisner seemed to want the flexibility to hold out on that number 2 position. It's also interesting to get Iger's point of view from what was happening at the time and his reflections 20 years after the event. At the time, this acquisition seemed fair. Some commented that ABC was bought slightly cheap in retrospect. It seems to have been a steal. This statement is surprising for me. Surely someone would have done the due diligence and calculated the net present value of the acquisition and then taken a view on the multiplier effect of legible assets. Recognising it as a steal now means someone back then severely undervalued it. Anyway, a real big risk for Eisner, but has paid off in unimaginable ways. Exactly. Seems they didn't know what they had. The acquisition gave Disney the scale to remain independent when other entertainment companies were coming to the painful realisation that they were too small to compete in a changing world. Oof, that's worth pausing on. It certainly seems as though roll-up and consolidation strategies seem to just suck out the value out of the marketplace. It makes it very difficult for an independent to get a foothold. It means making bigger commitments with more debt over a longer time period, taking bigger risks just to start to compete. The assets Disney acquired in the merger, especially ESPN, drove growth for years and were a vital buffer for nearly a decade as Disney Animation struggled with a series of box office disappointments. And there it is. It seems to have provided an insulation. And that's what's so interesting to me about this story. It's not just about doing business in the normal sense, but these strategic placements of assets are kind of time buffer, if you like. It's like a swapsies game, not just of assets or cash flows, but also of time. Disney might have needed ABC's assets to buffer restructuring, then, after, sell those assets to someone else who needs them, and then with the proceeds buy something else. It's a bit like trading on eBay, but on a massive scale. Sometimes there is time to develop internal assets, but sometimes there's a pressing need to buy them and integrate quickly. And sometimes that integration just won't fit and the deal is passed. And it seems often in M&A, mergers and acquisitions, that value is destroyed. Exuberant forecasts on all parties, sunk cost fallacies, burdensome debt, extraction of banking and legal fees, sometimes almost seem to cripple the transaction to such a point that almost immediately a new buyer and refinancing is sought. Fascinating subject. Kind of wish I knew a lot more about it, but there's a recent case here in the UK. I'm not too familiar with it, but it's the Tata Steel one. That one seems to be the latest whipping boy for the LBO raiders. Pension funds. Sometimes as a result, the fundamental problem still exists, but liability has been shifted. This doesn't create value. But I get it, sometimes I guess a tactical reprieve is necessary, a useful sidestepping. This is the whole thing. You're buying and selling risk, and depending on what else is going on, some risk you want to have, some you don't. So however you manage that risk, buy asset, sell asset, develop asset, spin it off, get another loan, pay off a loan, buy back some stock. Depends on whether financing is cheap, what the interest rates are, how your credit rating's going, all that kind of stuff. But what comes through in this book and this story is that every transaction, for Iger certainly, the prerequisite is that it has to create value for it to work. It's not about pinching cash flow or offloading debts or debt restructuring. Every deal listed in the book creates value, something new. And it's very convincing. Disney Wars, however, says other things, but that was in the time leading up to Iger's reign. But right after Disney's acquisition, and despite all the due diligence, Iger met with Disney with binders detailing all the structures and assets and deals in motion of ABC and its TV rights, its radio business, its cable channels, and they went through the lot, I think, over a weekend. There's a lot you don't know, Iger said. And he then detailed the contracts, the things that were about to expire, the full picture, even sensitive situations. Apparently this rattled Eisner. And then Iger told him there's a lot to get done, and some of the situations are urgent. And Disney Wars paints the picture that Eisner was a bit out of touch with how TV worked at that time, and that he thought Laverne and Shirley and Happy Days were something that Eisner kept mentioning to as his point of reference, but were in fact ancient history in TV time. Iger had to give him a reality check. In any event, Eisner brought in Michael Orvitz from a company called CAA. The book doesn't specify whether Eisner was waiting for Orvitz to leave CAA, the Creative Artists Agency, which Orvitz had founded. In any case, Orvitz was made president of Disney, not COO, which meant that while he was Iger's boss at the time, sort of complicated, he wasn't Eisner's preordained successor either. Come back to Orvitz. Iger also had surprises. At the core of Disney were the strategic planning boards, all MBA types who did evaluations and financial analysis. Eisner used the output of this unit to give a strong sense of security in business decisions. And it turns out strategic planning, also held the keys to the kingdom over many other business units of Disney. I've said it before, say it again, creativity doesn't show up in an Excel spreadsheet. At this point in the book, Iger mentions the success Eisner had at Disney with films like The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King. And I have to interject a little bit of a personal note. How can I not? So my parents were never really sold on the Disney proposition. I was brought up with the idea that Lord of the Rings was a much better read, that climbing Grisdale Pike was much more rewarding than Disneyland or some theme park. It was. Having said that, Mum and Dad did appreciate the early Disney films like Fantasia, mostly for the music and the visuals, but emphatically because there was hardly any spoken words or story. It was a audio-visual experience, a spectacle, something new, novel. I get that. But it does wear thin. I did make mention of Star Trek II and the birth of CGI. There was a huge novelty factor, but here we are. Everything now is CGI shit, but we'll get on to Pixar soon enough. But what Mum had a problem with were the stories like The Little Mermaid, Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast. Consider the story of The Little Mermaid, now in black. I know, modern day controversy. But let's review 1837. The original story. When a mermaid turns 15, she gets to go to the surface of the sea, and there she saves the prince. And he never sees her though. But she falls in love with him, and she goes back to Mermaid Land and explains it. Her wishes are granted. She will get the legs, at the cost of losing her voice and her tongue. And when she walks it will be painful and her feet will bleed constantly. But, the mermaid is told, she will win his heart. Of course, if she doesn't, she will die a broken heart and dissolve into sea foam. And so he marries a princess anyway. In the end, Little Mermaid is on the beach waiting to die, and her sisters show up with a knife, and all she has to do is kill the prince and everything goes back to normal. But she can't do that, so she dies and dissolves into sea foam. As it happens, she becomes a sea spirit, and all she needs to do now is 300 years of good deeds, and she will get to go to heaven. And that is why mermaids help sailors. So the latest much ado over skin tones are not really significant compared to the underlying and problematic message of that tale. I hope it was a cautionary tale and not an instruction manual. Anyway. So, ladies, if you want a man, you better give up your voice, and if you don't get a man, you're nothing, you dissolve. And that in order to fit in, you have to give up your identity, to do good deeds to get into heaven and be accepted, and to transform from a mermaid to something else. Well, that's the underlying point, yet missed and perpetuated, and let's not talk about Pocahontas. This is that reflexive feedback I mentioned. It's one thing to take a story which is compelling because of its critical narrative, but to miss that for the aesthetic and happy ever after ending seems somehow an issue. Some might say revisionist. And the number of times I've heard the wrong conclusion drawn on Animal Farm. See, it's proof that communism doesn't work. No, that's the point. At the end of the book, they'd gone back to capitalism. That's why you need constant revolution. Anyway, I've been to see the stage production of Lion King twice. Neither occasion solely for myself, of course, but it was a spectacular show for sure, though the second performance I saw some years after the first was decidedly less. Back to the book, and we're introduced to Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was responsible for a lot of the animation success, and it seems, as Iger would have us believe, that there was a bit of resentment set in since Katzenberg was not promoted to COO after the death of Frank Wells. So there's lots written in the press about Katzenberg's exit. Yeah, we'll leave that there for the moment. But Disney's animation did suffer after Katzenberg was exited, and a large legal battle ensued. What the book doesn't mention is that Katzenberg, by the way, the K in SKG, DreamWorks, SKG, S for Spielberg, K for Katzenberg, and G for Geffen, was formed in 1994. The book Disney Wars goes into details about how Katzenberg's contract was a bit of a Disney home goal or backfire or disaster, to say the least. Recall what we said about mitigating film risk and starting small and building up. Well, Eisner seemed to do this, but in reverse with Katzenberg's contract. And this is a story of how not to do it. It's remarkable. So at the time when Katzenberg came on board with Disney, the contract assured a 2% annuity on business that Katzenberg generated. So at the start, obviously, it was minuscule. And while Eisner was getting $70 million bonuses, Katzenberg only got $70,000, something like that. I think it was like that. It wasn't a lot. However, that 2% became very valuable, and at the point of Katzenberg's exit was worth about $80 to $100 million, and Eisner wouldn't pay. So the next several years would be punctuated by a slew of expensive failures at Disney: Hercules, Atlantis, Treasure Planet, Fantasia 2000, Brother Bear, Home on a Range, and Chicken Little. Others, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Mulan, Tarzan, and Lilo and Stitch, were modest successes. Yeah, I like Mulan, and I like Tarzan, and Hercules, of course, I said. I used to fall asleep to them. Not me, but, the woman I was sharing a bed with at the time. Hercules, I actually really like that one because it's got such a simple structure and it's so straightforward. So I know this is supposed to be about the business teachings and insights of Bob Iger, but the Disney adaptation of Hercules is almost fitting. Maybe that's not fair, but what I liked about Hercules was the irreverence to the character in the movie, in the animation. Hercules is painted almost as a sociopath. The emotional involvement is pleasantly superficial, nothing so heavy as, say, The Lion King. Yeah, the Lion King, cultural appropriation, inherited royal power, segregation of the race, species, how the dirty hyenas are less, what, you didn't see that? Oh, you thought it was all about the existential question posed by the circle of life. Hercules, self-aware, with meta-references to pop cultures of the time. It had something for the adults too. There's lots of inward-pointing jokes. Hades, Greek god of the dead, says he wouldn't even name his dog Pluto. Ha ha ha. But critically, it is actually one of the poorer Disney animations. The tone is all over the shop. For example, one of the main characters, Hercules' love interest, no less, is squished under a falling stone pillar, not quite dead, and Hercules rushes off to a comedic scene, and the fate of the crushed woman is just left for the moment. A bit like Rian Johnson's Star Wars, where Dameron Poe is kidding with Kylo Ren seconds after Kylo killed Poe's most respected father figure by gruesome beheading. The tonality is all over the shop. So after Hercules and Zeus have this song and dance, Hercules has to be reminded of Meg's crushing pillar predicament. Hercules doesn't really care, or is absent-minded, or has very childish and very easily distracted mind. Irreverent and superficial. I kind of like that. It's easy to fall asleep to. I think it's also a kind of reference to the capitalist machine. It works functionally, all-powerful and with strength, but with no moral direction until someone points out what is supposed to be done and holds it to account. In the story, the Disneyized version, Hades, voiced brilliantly by James Woods, keeps his bargains and Hercules breaks all of his. Again, it seems power without accountability becomes corrupt, but by comparison, Hades is at least honest. Having read Disney Wars since reading Iger's book, I can't help but wonder if this wasn't a kind of meta inward-pointing joke at Eisner. There's also references and a pop at sports celebrity types, which I think is what Hercules in the Disney animation is. Signing away of one's soul and morals to promote any old crap in exchange for the money. The celebs probably don't even use that product themselves. This puts the sports celebrity in a predicament, and I think we can refer back to the earlier episode we did on sports supplement empires. As we talked about in there, bodybuilders of old were on this supplement and that supplement and the other, chromium picolinate or super fructose GABA oil with extra chakras, whatever. So which one could be isolated as being the effective one? Or was it all of them? Or was it a specific combination? And when we asked the sports celeb to clarify, how can they possibly answer except with feigned indifference and deflection, something along the lines of, yeah, all of them, or I don't know really, I just do what the doctor says, or they're really all good products. It makes them into non-committal and irreverent characters. And ironically, the more popular they get, the more they need to keep their mouths shut so as to not alienate their markets. Let the plebs fill in with their own answers, which are more likely to be more favourable than an actual sensible answer from the athlete. God forbid they tell the truth and say, I don't take any of them. So that said, the animation Hercules does pay tribute to the 12 labours of Hercules, albeit in passing and in montage early in the animation. And it borrows a lot. Hercules' sidekick is a mirror to Stallone's Rocky's trainer, Mickey. Hercules' supreme power and athleticism paralleled to Superman. But there's no great fight to rise up to, as in the Rocky films, nor any need for a superhero to save the people. There is no threat to the people in the Disney Hercules film. So we have this kind of weird bastardized superhero that can't be a hero and an underdog that has no fight. Weird. So my earlier point that Hercules, the Disney version, seems a coincidental parallel to Iger's story itself. By that I mean, Hercules is all-powerful, finds fame and fortune and celebrity endorsements by accident, promoted by luck and happenstance. He never set out to do it, it just kind of happened to him. For Hercules, there's no learning, no moral dilemma, no testing of values that might impact identity. For the adult viewer, it's a slightly obscure reminder of what they already know. I think that's why I liked it as a bedtime movie to fall asleep to. It just confirms what we already know without asking deep questions about what should be done, what ought to be done. And it poses no moral dilemmas or intractable existential questions. In other words, there's no moral tension, nothing is at risk, no real conflict, nothing to resolve. It eases you into a slumber. There is nothing more to know, and there's no compulsion to stay awake to see how the story ends. I rarely made it to the end. Fell asleep, always. So anyway, Jeffrey Katzenberg was kicked out, left Disney, and not there long after founded DreamWorks. There's a lot more to that story. This book doesn't really go into it, but it was a series of disastrous decisions by Eisner that may well have actually ended Disney. And I think here, Steve Jobs is actually the unsung hero, but not without self-serving interests, of course. But, I don't think Steve Jobs was like that. So as SKG set up shop, they needed to attract animators, and they paid top dollar, more than top dollar, which certainly had the impact of increasing by a significant amount Disney's wage bill for its animators. I should also mention SKG was founded almost as a dare by a third-party interjector on a chance phone conversation. Yeah, there it is again. Look, meets talent, meets money, meets opportunity and timing. And what made a bad situation worse was Eisner's refusal to settle Katzenberg's contract. Geffen got involved as a third-party negotiator and relayed to Disney that Katzenberg would settle for $60 million, a steep discount on the $100 million owed. Eisner refused. Disney Wars doesn't really go into the thinking behind this decision, but I'm sure Eisner would recognise the problem of supplying a new competitor upstart with its seed capital. Maybe it was a delay tactic, but Geffen was already a billionaire, Spielberg was likely close, and Katzenberg was actually the poorest of them all. Needless to say, 5 years down the road, the matter of Katzenberg's contract was settled for $280 million. Yeah. Meanwhile, fucking bad decisions. Meanwhile, turns out Disney was a centralised, process-oriented company driven by this core strategic unit, referred to as strategic planning. And from reading around Buffett, he prefers a more distributed structure. Each level of management is like its own small business unit, responsible for its own risks and success, provided with motivations and allocated resources. The book to read about Buffett is The Real Warren Buffett by McLaughlin. Though Snowball is the definitive text. It's a long old read, but I think McLaughlin's book was more insightful. Yeah, so I think if I got it right, it's Berkshire Hathaway. It's one of those ironies. If there ever was a business failure that Warren Buffett had invested in, it was Berkshire Hathaway. It was a textile company. It didn't do very well, but he kept the name. Mind you, I think there was a scandal a few years back, Solar City. I think they took Buffett for $200 million. I think there's one more recently for 117 that rings a bell. But yeah, I'd previously read about Buffett's management style, and now I do know where he got it from. Tom Murphy, Decentralise, create smaller self-similar units of motivated people and allocate capital. That's Buffett's war cry. And then motivate these tiers of management to replicate the same attitude down the chain. So yeah, culture clash was inevitable. Disney, this authoritative and demanding, not so supportive and collaborative centralised unit. Iger, Tom and Dan's outlook, the opposite. So Iger tells a story of when he joined quite soon thereafter. He wanted to start a magazine under the Disney company and made the executive decision to do so. He was told, it doesn't work that way here. It seems Eisner had to run it all through strat plan to get a tick of approval. The very opposite of entrepreneurial thinking. Yeah, those corporate structures do knock it out of you. I recall once putting in a request for some stationery when I worked for a large bank, and the floor manager was on holiday, her supervisor off sick, and so the request got escalated at one level, who didn't know anything about it, so it got bounced up one more level to John Bond, CEO of HSBC, who said he didn't care how many pens I had. Trombone oil. There's a story in the book about trombone oil. In short, put your time where it will yield maximum return. There's not much trombone oil sold per year, but it can charge a high price for it, but you just won't sell much. Meanwhile, Orvitz's relationship with Eisner was disintegrating. It seems Orvitz had his sights on bigger things, and the number 2 position in Disney was a kind of a stopgap. But Orvitz was a different kind of fish. It seems he was an ideas man more than an operations guy, which is what the number 2 position demanded. So the book cites a few examples of so-called omnibus celebrity deals he might have suggested that on paper look good but seldom turn out well. These are those celebrity endorsements that plug the celebrities into Disney across all of its structure. It's not vertical but horizontal, and that requires a lot of management, cross-management support. Yes, the self-awareness in Hercules isn't lost, is it? Horvitz was well connected in Hollywood via his agency, and serving those relationships seemed to interfere with the Disney duties. Meetings were cancelled or interrupted by calls from A-listers like Tom Cruise. This was seen as a disrespect to other executives, which created backchatter. This is the impression that Iger leaves us with, having read his book. But in Stewart's book, Disney Wars, it's told slightly differently. It's told that these meetings that Horvitz went to were largely nothing to do with him, or the kind of perfunctory meetings where each person gets a turn waxing lyrical. They yielded no actions, no insight, and were boring to Horvitz, so he would just leave. Cool. Under such circumstances, probably sensible. And I get how those lower down the chain might even be jealous of not being able to escape the perfunctory, brain-numbing, weekly compelled game of Lingo Bingo. Yes, the secret to productive meetings. Remove the chairs. Managing your own time and respecting others' time is one of the most vital things to do as a manager, and he was horrendous at it, says Iger. Well, this is a problem of one-sided information. I'm sure Horvitz's clients and talent to whom he was giving his attention thought the opposite. In the end, though, Horvitz wasn't a good fit. I think he was between a rock and a very hard place, a victim of Eisner's creativity and Iger's realism to the new order. Horvitz fit neither. Iger says you have to hear out other people's problems and help find solutions. It's all part of being a great manager. The problem was, Michael Horvitz wasn't a manager, he was still an agent. But he did know that business better than anyone, but it was not the business that Disney were in. In the end, Horvitz was exited too, or fired, or left, or whatevs. Iger says both Eisner and Horvitz should have known better. The struggled relationship dragged on for months too long. They should have both known that it couldn't work, but they willfully avoided asking the hard questions because each was somewhat blinded by their own needs. It's a hard thing to do, especially in the moment, but those instances in which you find yourself hoping that something will work out without being able to convincingly explain to yourself how it will work, well, that's when a little bell should go off and you should walk yourself through some clarifying questions. What's the problem I need to solve? Does this solution make sense? If I'm feeling some doubt, why? Am I doing this for sound reasons, or am I motivated by something personal? But Eisner and Horvitz did know better. And certainly from Stewart's book, it paints the picture that Horvitz made a huge commitment to try and make it work. He kind of knew he was in the wrong place. He knew that it probably shouldn't be there, but he did put full commitment to try and make it work. Eisner, the same. He knew Horvitz wasn't a good fit, but I think he let it drag on for a bit too long too. Stewart gives further insight into the Horvitz affair with painful clarity. Right after Eisner gave Horvitz the deal by phone, he called Tony Schwartz and said, "I think I just made the biggest mistake of my career." Prophetic. Very shortly after, Eisner arranged a meeting with Horvitz at Eisner's Bel Air mansion. Horvitz expected to see Disney's head of PR. They were, after all, crafting the press release for the news. What he didn't expect was to see Sandy Litvak, at the time Chief Administration Officer and General Counsel, and Steve Bollenbach, the Chief Financial Officer. Bold as brass, they both said to Horvitz's face, "Welcome to Disney, we won't work for you or report to you." This apparently was a shock to Eisner. Well, stuff happened. That situation, it got out of hand beyond the scope of Iger's book, but it's all in Disney Wars. Suffice to say, Eisner tried to smooth the way, and this was disastrous, as he tried to make Horvitz a kind of quasi number two, but Litvak and Bollenbach would report to Eisner, so they were kind of number two, so it was all ambiguous right from the start, and Horvitz was undermined on day zero. So after this kind of disastrous meeting and Eisner trying to smooth it all out by taking him to a side room and the others to a side room and telling one person this, another person the same thing, promising both everything, when Horvitz got home that night, he looked stricken. "What's the matter?" his wife said. He replied, "I just made the biggest mistake of my career." So they both knew. Yet Eisner forged ahead. Horvitz forged ahead. It was never going to work. They both knew it. Yeah, so if anything, Disney War paints Horvitz in a good light. He did seem to give it everything to try and make it work, but he was in a catch-22. The perception and reputational damage for both men was significant should either have made the decision to reverse this course of action so soon after making such a significant decision. Institutional imperatives and reputation and all that kind of jazz. So the number 2 position was, I don't want to say open again, but remained open and stayed open for another 3 years. And this hot and cold relationship existed between Eisner and Iger. Approach and avoidance, approach and avoidance. So to me, this is all very strange. It's like a perfect candidate showing up for a job interview. All references check out. They have the grades and experience, yet there's a 3-year gap in a CV without explanation. Strange. Was it an extended holiday or perhaps jail time or something else? Never really sure to ask. So yeah, Iger notes that as a leader, you want people around you to be eager to take on responsibility, but not to let ambition get too far ahead of opportunity. Talked about this before with the films. Start small, patience, hard work, add value, more patience. I think this is a recent battle cry from Gary Vaynerchuk on one of his videos. The way Iger puts it is, if you're putting all your focus on that very small thing in the very distant future, you're missing the big picture of now. And then ambition becomes counterproductive. Indeed, in the very next paragraph of Iger's book, he says more or less the same thing as Gary Vaynerchuk. Do the job well, be patient, look for opportunities, expand, grow, keep a good attitude, high energy and focus. I think there's a good quote by Thomas Edison. He said, opportunity is missed by most people because it's dressed in overalls and looks like hard work. The dynamics between CEO and the next person in line for his or her job are often fraught, though. Iger continues, we all want to believe we're irreplaceable. The trick is to be self-aware. Just pick any politician and just... The trick is to be self-aware enough that you don't cling to the notion that you are the only person who can do this job. At its essence, good leadership isn't about being indispensable. It's about helping others be prepared to possibly step into your shoes, giving them access to your own decision-making, identifying the skills they need to develop and helping them improve. And, as Iger says he had to do, sometimes being honest with them about why they're not actually ready for the next step up. So having just mentioned expand, spot opportunity, patience, it seems Iger practices this too, of course. Opportunity for efficiencies and the leverage from this, not just as a cost cut, but to streamline operations and workflows. Early in Iger's tenure, Disney was splattered all over the globe with no coherent IT or communication structure. So, next big job, sort that out. Expand, consolidate, streamline, optimize, leverage opportunities or sell off and expand, repeat. And our man Iger had international experience and was duly charged with this task, more or less as a prerequisite to opening a massive Disney park in China. Oh boy, there's that story. Hong Kong. Mistakes were made, but of course, comes with the territory. Meanwhile, ABC was in a downward slide. Saved, it seems, by Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which pulled in 30 million viewers, which surprised Iger even by his own accounts. The popularity of Millionaire, which was a UK export, was sparked by a fortuitous mistake. I'm sure you know the game format, and in one of the early shows, a mistake was made by the production company. The story has it, the manual for the game, the instructions and its production process notes manual, had only just been flown over from the UK with its creator. During an early episode, a mistake in the application of the rules saw a contestant unfairly disqualified, and he missed his chance at a big win. The injustice made it into the press, and outrage followed. This helped to make the show an overnight success. Indeed, the price of mistakes, not always a bad thing. So this was 1998, and 2000 was obviously looming. Iger had foresight to plan a big show for the new millennium, 18 months out. Wow, 18 months planning for one night. Well, 24 hours as it happens, as they tracked the rollover from 1999 to 2000 from multiple locations as time zones crossed the millennium dateline. And Iger turned to Rune to make it happen. It's kind of a bittersweet story in the book. It was Rune's last big show. And after a while, after that, he was taken ill, and with it, his acknowledgement that the world had moved on and that things were not what they used to be. Yeah, I find it a little bit disturbing myself. I mean, it's the nature of things. You start in corporate and are progressed up and out and eventually aged out. It's one thing to run a multinational, but to keep abreast of changes coming up from below while on top is very difficult. And the best people to implement the new tech are the people who created it, the kids who are familiar with it, the new generation, up and out, and they too will eventually meet their up and out and come to this realization. There was one film that epitomized this thought and this narrative. If you've ever seen it with Michael Douglas, Falling Down, that's exactly what that film was about. Being shat on one too many times, a cog in a system that's changed and no longer requires that cog, cast aside, economically not viable, obsolete. Yeah, happening faster and faster. So this constant bubbling of innovation, and occasionally it seems to reach breakout thresholds. So at some point, a new method or a new technology will get just cheap enough to justify the switching costs. And we saw this in 1977 with Star Wars and the new special effects and the new camera setups. Innovation. Indeed, Lucas even said that he started on episode 4 because he couldn't figure out how to do the effects he had in mind for episodes 1, 2 and 3, which were made later. And, as it happens, those prequels were accompanied by another breakthrough in digital filmmaking, Lucas, again. So these innovations seem to constantly bubble away, the new. Back then, every 10 or 15 years or so. Nowadays, seems more like every 5 or 6 years there's a new breakthrough. Kind of an order of magnitude difference. So if we do a quick look at travel, initially walking 3 miles per hour. And then we invented horses, 30 miles per hour. And then we found liquid dinosaurs. Yeah, I know it wasn't dinosaurs, it just sounds cool. And then we invented internal combustion engines that got up to 60 miles per hour. And then we invented flying things, which today do about 600 miles per hour. So the next leap that makes sense is going to be in the region of 5,000 miles per hour or something. And that's going to require incredible technical limits to be exceeded. Same with computing and Moore's law. That's a 10 times scale in every 7 years or so. Hence, Bitcoin came out of nowhere. That's another game changer. GPU and parallel processing has come in leaps and bounds in the last couple of years, and has significantly lowered the cost of CGI and artificial intelligence and big data research. Hence, the recent emergences of deep fakes, facial recognition, big data and predictive crime systems, individual ad bots, web bots, chat bots, and all that bullshit. It's hard to keep abreast of the innovation while managing from the very, very top. It's also a bit weird, don't you think, that the corporations will survive all the people that have dedicated so much time and effort in the furtherance of these corporations. And although the corporations will survive, the innovations that kept them bubbling away, the value that was created and the expensive R&D is eventually eroded. It's all devalued. It's like not so long ago to reach a global audience, you needed a $200 million broadcasting infrastructure with a satellite, which were not cheap things. Now that's kind of, that infrastructure is still there, but the so-called democratization of those kind of platforms has meant that anyone with a $200 phone can get on it. Where next? Who can say? It's not what it used to be. Yeah, so I was looking through the open libraries of Python programming language. It's got everything in there. It's from open computer vision, amazing math libraries, AI libraries. If you have the talent, what you can do with a $5,000 rig is quite something. For even less than that, you can rent the compute from the cloud grid and do even more. And I definitely have the impression that tech investors are throwing big money at these kinds of startups. While it is impressive, the barrier to entry is so low and the ability to replicate is so high. Anybody with a half-decent GPU card and a working knowledge of Python and being plugged into the communities that develop the libraries can cobble something together that's quite spectacular. See it all the time in the artificial intelligence forums. The formula seems to be come up with a novel idea, write a paper, get it published in a predatory journal, cite your source, create a startup around it, write the code, and then try and go for an IPO, get Series A funding, 20 million, 30 million. It's just, fuck it, good luck to him. Buyer beware and all that. Yeah. Gary Vee recently mentioned that his grand plan was to buy up underpriced assets during the upcoming recession, though he didn't specify when he thought that might be, but I think we can all have a good guess. And it's a point of political divide at the moment. Oh no, another diversion. So is it me, or are the politicians just putting it off, kicking that can down the road? You know, it only works for so long, and it eventually hits a hard limit. It just can't be compressed anymore. It's like, you know, this is crunch time now. And can you feel the compression in the air? I can, you know, like Trump and fucking racism and bigotry and fascism. And here in the UK with Brexit, you know, it seems to be getting to crunch time. Or maybe this is the new norm. This heightened state of anxiety and constant emergency is the new norm. Oh God, I hope not. Kind of reminds me of movie franchises. You know, the first film, the original one, was great. the second or part two or the follow-up one was the cheap cash in to double the profitability off of the first film for cheap investment because it carried so much brand equity. Rarely the sequel better than the original. And third time is just cannibalizing your own IP. Fourth is nothing short of a parody. And if you have the audacity to stretch it out to a fifth in the series, it reaches a kind of mental hard limit. Usually at this stage, the motivations of the characters are exhausted. The world building, the rules of that world are exhausted, and there's nowhere left to go. There's no more to squeeze out of it. It reaches this kind of hard limit. You know, all the sharks have been jumped. There's nowhere to go. You know, we've been through all the full gamut of emotional experiences, the freeze, the appease, the fight, the flight, and submission is all that's left. You can only patch it up, rephrase it, reboot it, relaunch it so many times before the audience see the deceit. Suspension of disbelief is one thing stretched out too far, and eventually it becomes a lie that a politician one day ends up telling the Queen, or tweets out every other day, impeach. This is it though. Institutional imperatives. Warren Buffett warned about it. Tom Murphy knew about it. And maybe even Eisner knew too. But then why did he wait so long to fill that number 2 position? Yeah, there's a lot more to that story. It's covered, I think, in Disney Wars. But this is the point I'm trying to make, that we've got to keep Iger's book in context. That he claims he's written this book himself. And we've got to keep it in the context of an outgoing CEO legacy protection book. And the kind of related kind of oblique point that I'm making is that we've got to remember innovation. You know, even in politics, geopolitics, there's innovation. Technology spread, new information is more accessible than ever. Now people are much, much more well-travelled than ever before, much, much more sophisticated than before. So it seems the business itself of politicking must take so much time that it almost makes politics itself impossible. And this is why I laugh a little bit. You know, those boundaries of diminishing returns are now popping up everywhere. We seem to be hitting hard limits. Innovation seems to be so quickly absorbed because we've got such efficient transport protocols in terms of doing instant transactions. You know, so the actual cost of doing the transaction is so small now. It makes absorbing new technologies and absorbing new information and absorbing new strategies so quick. And sometimes it seems to create as many problems as it solves, which seems the nature of things. Take artificial intelligence and the recent phenomena of deep fake or fake news. We now have to expend as much energy detecting for deep fakes as it takes to make them. And D.A.R.P.A has AI projects designed to resist adversarial artificial intelligence attacks. And the power consumption of those search engine servers is tremendous. And what do we search for? I don't know. Is Britney still a thing? Flat Earth? Who knows? I want to say it's a beautiful whole mess, but I don't know. I think we're all just searching for the next new best thing. Yeah. So my point was that there's all this innovation, for example, going on in AI about making neural networks that can identify objects from images. So suppose you can produce big data or an algorithm or a neural net that can identify someone holding a gun from live streaming cameras, and therefore you can dispatch police immediately. So this is an example of inserting your IP into a current asset, something Gary Vee was talking about, and I think that's what he meant. It's not just selling the IP into it, but in this example of waiting for a recession so that he would also buy up all the CCTV companies cheap and then put his value lift in, which would have a multiplier effect on all assets, and then after implementation, post-recession, sell off for a tidy sum, I guess. Innovate or die. Rune certainly told Iger enough times. ABC continued to slide in the ratings war. The other networks were getting their act together and grabbing attention from the viewers with great shows like CSI and Survivor from CBS. Meanwhile, Eisner was becoming more isolated and critical. After the Ovitz episode, it seems Eisner was even more cautious. So in response, Iger stepped up the number of episodes of Millionaire per week, an easy fix, as Iger said. I have to wonder about that. Disney Wars was also critical of that. There was a question of viewer burnout, but Millionaire was so popular it actually caused a revolt from viewers when the cable company turned it off due to a failure of Disney to negotiate with the cable company when their contract expired. The cable company were within their rights, but mob ruled, and Millionaire held so much sway that the cable company capitulated. Then along came Survivor, and all but killed Millionaire. The irony was that Survivor had been pitched to ABC, and ABC had turned it down. Twice. But it was a risky business. Because of the format, the show required a full commitment to an entire series. A pilot show was too expensive to justify. It was an all-or-nothing type deal. So much for risk. It's only a matter of time. And one thing I've learned, I guess you're getting to know me a little bit by now, I like to binge watch the TV sets. The first was Lost, then 24 with Kiefer Sutherland. I think I watched a full season in a day when that came out, when I got it on DVD. Then Mad Men, I watched all of them in about a week. I find it's better this way. I can recall when I was kind of queuing up the final season of Mad Men, I thought, oh wow, the CGI and the children is really good. They've done a really good job aging them for the story. But then I realised, actually, I just compressed into 7 days what took 7 years of broadcasting schedule. That kind of made the finale of Mad Men even more profound. I think also watching sometimes at 1.5, 1.7 times speed is useful. Time itself is another boundary condition. We expect things to happen at a certain pace. So, for example, in NLP, they teach that changing the pace and direction of time changes the meaning of things. Fast phobia model. So this is where, if you've got something that you've got a mild aversion to or like a phobic response to, that movie, that thing that you're responding to, you play it backwards in your mind, you change the speed, you add stupid music to it, and you kind of disentangle the emotional attachment, because it's just ridiculous now when you play that thing backwards. Now add a laughing soundtrack and you change the speed of that thing in your mind, so it becomes a non-issue. Then Scandal, binged watched that, seen the flip-flopping of the Rashomon effect and how it changes meaning as new information or non-linear time reveals more in the story. And coincidentally, at the time of recording this, just heard an announcement that Netflix is allowing people to play the films at different speed. And the film producers are not too happy about that. And the dirty little secret about allowing people to play movies back faster, even at 5 or even 10% faster, is in the same amount of time that you would normally take to watch it at 1 time speed, you can squeeze in another round of adverts. Suits, I only got up to season 5, and Futurama, I closed that out recently except for the last half of season 7, Person of Interest. Interesting to note Jar Jar Abrams' involvement on that. Don't mention Star Wars. So I recall a friend giving me a copy of True Blood way back in the when, all those years ago. The early progenitor of this kind of new, grittier, more adult-themed TV with more swearing, more nudity than would otherwise be gotten away with. But the box sets, man, they play on anxieties far, far, far too much. I like to know. I've got to get closure. and I've got to get me resolutions. But then this is the magic to a good Hollywood script, isn't it? John Truby again, anatomy of story, and all about creating tension and conflict, which we've talked a little bit about. How that tension or FOMO or anxiety is played out with online marketing. I've concluded I don't like it, but this is the game in it. It can go too far, like anything else in life, and then just becomes a misery of concerns and worries. And I'm sure there's an insurance policy for every one of those anxieties. I seem to endure a kind of meta-anxiety when I see adverts that are so naive, and I want to shout out to the product owner or the person trying to sell that shit. Your ad is based on a false premise. You've got it all wrong from the start. But it doesn't matter. No one seems to care about the truth. It's a race to the bottom. But this new thing that Netflix are introducing that allows people to change the playback speed of the films does raise another interesting social question. Is it the case that people can play the films back at 2 times speed and now watch 2 films in the space of where they would normally have only been able to watch 1? In other words, they are building greater social awareness because they can talk to more friends about more films. So it provides a certain amount of social connectivity. There's a certain anxiety there to have watched the latest box set or to have seen that new film and to have the cultural references to be able to share the in-jokes. So this is evolution in action. Again, who knew the customer wanted or needed this? I'm all for making films that engage emotionally and combine emotional responses in a new way. But for me, there has to be a tonal respect. But, again, having said that, if you look at, say, for example, like a Michael Bay film, the films are, it's even difficult to put words to it. What are they? They're a tour de force in action. They're a tour de force in CGI. They're an absolute tour de force in relentless action. But that's the point. It goes from start of the film to full-on action in the first 5 minutes, and then it just maintains that pace all the way through end. And when you've finished watching a Michael Bay film, it's like, wow, that was great. What was it about? I don't know, but it was great. And all you left with is a sense of, I don't know what the fuck that was, but it's freaking awesome. There's no time for, like ups and downs in the film, peaks and troughs and climaxes, and then return to a more calm state to allow your mind to cogitate what you've just seen, to allow you to get buy-in, to identify with the characters. It's just go, 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 go. And it's quite a thing. It must be quite difficult to actually achieve that, but, that's what he does. But then, what is there to learn from a Transformers film? It's just pure guilty pleasure, isn't it? It is what it is. So I think, for the greats, there has to be a time for reflection. I think it's the question posed in the Bacon episode, which is answered in part 2. How long can a salesman keep their trap shut after asking an insightful question? Less than 1 second. You need a good 10 seconds for full transdurational search. The interlocutor has to engage their brain long enough to fully realise that there's a big hole at the end of that question that you've just asked. You can't tell them it's there. They have to kind of feel it in their neurology. The brain has to go searching for an answer. It's not there. Search over here. It's not there either. Search over there. Search this. Try that. Oh shit. Big hole. And again, maybe it's just me, but sometimes, for example, with 24 or Scandal or Person of Interest, I had to pause the show just to let a few things integrate. What would I do in that situation? What would I say? How would I resolve that? And I know that I first position too much with these shows and shouldn't watch them so much, but I think that's indicative of great script writing. And I noticed something else as well about identity to do with self-reflection. I kind of realised self-identity, self-reflection is a bit of a misnomer. It's more a case of having one's flaws reflected. Sometimes I've found TV shows can do this, especially where the audience is enticed to quick judgment and the Rashomon effect is exploited. It's the basic premise of a joke, an incendiary premise, or a setup with an unseen ambiguity for which the comedian has realised the audience will eventually pick up on, and that's what makes it funny, that someone else, the comedian, has seen our folly and exploited it, yet we're also in a room with 2,000 other people that all have that same folly, and then the comedian delivers the punchline, which amplifies the absurdity of that small folly and obliterates it to ridiculousness. We've had learning, one of our barriers has been broken down, one of our biases has just been smashed, or a small part of our hypocrisy has just been let go, and we're now free of that flaw or thought, or at least loosened our mental rigidity on that subject, but only if we laughed. So to me, this is the danger of policing comedy too much. Talking about those problematic subjects can be quite confrontational, can be intimidating, can cause a lot of anxiety. And it seems to me the best way to get around it or over it is to let the tension go first, to get that bit out of the way. And cracking a good joke paves the way. It's kind of like that, although this is serious, let's not be serious about the way we talk about it. But that doesn't mean to say that the outcome of what we decide to do is frivolous. But, let's not restrict what we can discuss about it, because if we leave anything off the table that might come back later, then we're not having a good, honest discussion. And that kind of brings us on to another small part about filmmaking, the film edit, which is designed specifically to release information to the viewer in a way that builds engagement. It provides just enough dots, but leaves the audience to connect them. Well, a good film does. And so, in a way, the audience almost, I don't want to say crafts their own film, but builds their own experience of it. I think it's gone too far when the audience is left to, retrospectively write the script. To make the film make sense, they have to do all these convolutions about backstory and what might have occurred that would make this, what would otherwise be an error in script writing, fit in with the suspension of disbelief. And films I particularly enjoy are the ones with the moral dilemmas, as per Sicario and The Counselor. But I also like those films because they're wrapped in something that's just so far away from our everyday experience. It allows us to have the ethical or moral dilemma kind of at a safe distance because, we don't have day-to-day interactions with the cartel. But we can experience those kind of questions. But what I don't like are more gritty films that have the same moral dilemmas but much closer to home because it's just too charged. Causes a moment of deep self-reflection, and this perception of self is then forced. And this is that descent we talked about in the Francis Bacon Part 2 video. And the way we climb out of that is, the art, the discovery. So the introspection is actually listening to an amalgamation of values and beliefs or ideas of those people around us, or those people we've just listened to, or the script writers of the film, or the editor of the film. Again, it's kind of like why I liked Disney's Hercules, because it didn't have this effect. Yeah, so in movies or films, the aesthetics and the timing compounds the significance, the sound, the music, the mirroring neuron effects, color grading, the editing, Kuleshov effects, and so on, seem to have a temporal coupling. That is to say, you can't do these things too slow, and you can't do them too quickly. It ruins it. So the playback of the film at different speeds changes the emotional payload and the aesthetic changes. And for me, this kind of softens the emotional payload. I need that distance, but I still have to stop from time to time to integrate the meaning, the core values that the film was trying to get over, what was actually said and the implications, and then resume. Otherwise, I just find it just rushes over. Great films hook the audience, get them invested, cause them to wonder what they would do in that situation, either as the protagonist or antagonist, first perceptual position, second perceptual position, or even third perceptual positions. And the really good films make space for thought after a revelation or a twist in the tale. The audience has to process that, and they need time. How long? 6 to 10 seconds. This is engagement. This is empathy, pacing, then lead, not lead, then pace. So same with books. I like to read things that are profound, and I recognise when it conflicts with something I believe or hold to be true, or that challenges something that I have in my own mind. I have to give time to integrate that. I have to do a role play in my head, seeing which ideas win out in the end, playing through as the protagonist or antagonist. What would I do? There's a little bit of a lesson here, I think, to be learned from the police and other such services. Key words again are time, distance, cover. Cover, because you don't know how the other person is going to react to what you have to say, and what you have to say You have to give the person time to integrate, and you have to give them distance so that they can be heard. The interlocutor is often in shock when facing a raised taser or worse, loaded firearm, and then this phenomenon of auditory exclusion becomes a factor. The brain is overloaded, they're in fight or flight mode, and language processing gets a much lower processing priority. That's why it's important to speak clearly, slowly, and repeat, and then give time for process. And to give a single simple instruction. Having two cops on the same scene shouting conflicting orders just gets people shot because it's impossible to comply. Officers that bark questions one after the other, or interrupting an answer by asking another question that leads to frustration and escalation. I sometimes think this is done on purpose, sometimes as a result of insufficient training, budget cuts because, reasons, whatever. So this is not engagement in a good way. This is engagement of the enemy kind of engagement. And I wonder if this is actually misunderstood or a misunderstanding, that the term engage is assumed to have a military context, because police are in paramilitary uniform, whereas perhaps engagement is more akin to film narrative and insight, and asking clear, concise questions and then giving time and distance allows for engagement based around empathy rather than hot lead.